Jen Robinson, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks, Sarah.
What was Julian Assange's mood on the plane as you approached Australian territory?
He was just thrilled. It was a bit surreal for all of us, I think. It's been 14 long years of legal battles. People said it would be impossible, that we'd never get him home. He'd spend the rest of his life in a US prison. And to bring him back to Australia, it was just wonderful.
And that moment when the plane actually touches down and it is done, there's a physical, you are physically there. What did that mean for him and for everybody travelling with him?
It was amazing, really. It was really emotional. I was brought to tears. My phone rang as soon as we landed. It was the Prime Minister calling us to welcome him home. They had a really moving conversation. Julian said, "You know, you saved my life." It was incredibly moving, and to be there to celebrate, to have our Kevin Rudd, our ambassador to the US, Stephen Smith, our High Commissioner to London, on the plane there with us, it was really special. And to watch him step off the plane to Canberra and to see Stella, to hug Stella like that, honestly, it was one of the most satisfying moment of my career, and a day that I wasn't sure we'd get to see. I always hoped we would, and I kept working at it, thinking and hoping that we had to, because justice demanded it. But it wasn't a given, and to see it happen was remarkable.
Now, I understand that the negotiations had been going on for months. When was the moment where you thought that a resolution, not the final resolution, but that a resolution could be arrived at?
Well, as you said, we have been in complex, difficult negotiations with the Department of Justice for many months to reach the plea deal that we reached. And honestly, it was only really in the last month or so where I began to think we might actually get there. And I have to thank our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, for his principled leadership, Ambassador Kevin Rudd for the relentless efforts that he put in Washington, which really shifted the dial for us in Washington and opened up conversations with the Department of Justice that we were not able to have before that. And so it's been really touch and go. We've been working around the clock for the last month to make this happen. Obviously, you can imagine a huge amount of diplomatic resources went into making this happen. A lot of our time back and forth with the DOJ to get there. And thankfully we got there. But it was a long and difficult process.
Now, just on that point that you mentioned in relation to Kevin Rudd and the conversations with the DOJ, what is it that he was saying that was different? What changed with the efforts that he was making?
Once Ambassador Rudd was in DC, really there was a sea change in terms of the Australian government's position. So of course, Prime Minister Albanese had said, as leader of the opposition, enough is enough, this has to come to an end. But it was really after Ambassador Rudd was placed in DC that we started to see things move. And clearly, Prime Minister Albanese's position was being put forcefully by our mission in DC. That opened up conversations for us with the Department of Justice that we previously had we were trying to have, and we're not getting responses. And so things moved. But of course, there were other broader legal factors that played into that. So we won leave to appeal in the United Kingdom earlier this year. The British High Court was concerned that Julian would not be granted First Amendment protections if he was extradited because he's an Australian citizen, because he's a foreign citizen. So it was a big blow to the US's case. And I think with the impending US election, they did not want to lose the case, but they also did not want to have an Espionage Act trial in an election year, which the entire US media would have been against. So I think it was a combination of factors. It was the political support that we had from Australia and the legal work that we had been doing in the British courts.
So you've got pressure coming from different events in different countries. And just to understand some of the technical arguments that began during that time, how important was it for the Americans that Julian Assange plead guilty to some or any of the charges?
That was the only way that we were going to get him out of prison. That was the baseline. So we had to, in engaging with that negotiation, it was the only way we were going to get him out. The only way he was going to get his freedom was to plead guilty to an offence. And of course, I want to make very clear, he has pleaded guilty to a charge of conspiracy to commit espionage for receiving and publishing information from a government source which revealed evidence of war crimes, human rights violations and wrongdoing by the United States government. That is doing journalism. That is criminalising journalism. But that is what he had to do for his freedom. And that is a problem when we talk about free speech and we talk about journalism.
Now, just in relation to that guilty plea, did Julian Assange have to be persuaded by you or by his team or by Kevin Rudd to accept that he was going to have to plead guilty to something?
Well, I want to make clear that the Australian government played no role in the plea deal negotiations. That was absolutely a negotiation between our legal team and the Department of Justice. This was Julian's decision. If you look at the prospects of what he was facing, even though we'd won right to appeal in the UK, it could have taken us another number of years to win that appeal, and even if we won, it would only have protected him from extradition from the United Kingdom. That indictment in the US still would have been live. The US could have extradited him from any other country in the world. If he lost, and if we lost the extradition case, he would have been extradited to the United States to prison conditions that the medical evidence showed would cause his suicide, to a country where the CIA plotted to kidnap and kill him. Now, neither of those options were good. When offered a plea deal that ensured his freedom and that this was over and that he could come home and be with his family, you can see that that's a rational choice.
I guess that's what I'm trying to understand is not his motivation for agreeing to the deal, but it's the moment where that idea, which was always a deal breaker for the Americans, became something that you could genuinely negotiate over.
The question was when the Americans were going to come to the table to even have that conversation. And that conversation only really started in the last 6 months. That was a conversation that we were always open to. Of course, our primary position was this case should never have been brought.
And how difficult was it to get to the particular count that Julian Assange pleaded to? How hard was that negotiation arriving at that point, which was the pleading guilty to the conspiracy, that is, to work with Chelsea Manning or Bradley Manning at the time to secure the documents that were then published? How important was that count for them?
It was the count that they insisted upon. And it's interesting that you have a US government insisting on a count that absolutely is criminalising journalism. That is the precedent that they wanted to set. Now, of course, I have to make clear, a plea deal is not a judicial precedent. It is not a court decision. Had Julian been extradited and we had fought that in the US courts and we had got to the Supreme Court and we got a decision against us, that would have set a dangerous precedent. But it's the prosecution itself that is setting the precedent.
Let's come to those extraordinary proceedings in the Mariana Islands in Saipan. You certainly couldn't script the story that it ended up in that place. Now, in the amended plea agreement, it says that the United States has not identified any victim qualifying for individual restitution. So how significant was it that they were not producing victims of what they allege was a crime?
Well, this is the point, Sarah, and I'm glad you raise it. There was no evidence that anyone was physically harmed as a result of WikiLeaks publications. This is a point that has been repeated to me in interviews, repeated by government officials ad nauseum for the past decade. WikiLeaks caused harm. People were killed because of these releases. The US government could not identify one victim who deserved restitution in this case, not one victim who suffered actual harm. And it's important the public hear and understand that. Not only that, there was no allegation of or reference to hacking anywhere in this plea deal because there was no hacking and the government could not make that case. And yet when you hear people talk about WikiLeaks, say, well, he hacked, well, he put lives at risk. Nowhere in that plea deal or in that statement of facts do you see anything of the sort. And I think it's really important that that point is made clear and people begin to understand that.
And just briefly on this, because he's also entitled to a moment of privacy. As somebody said today, freedom comes very slowly. You were obviously, all of you in his team, very concerned about his health while he was in Belmarsh prison. How is his physical and mental health?
Look, it's going to be a big adjustment for him. As we got onto the plane, for example, he was marvelling at seeing the horizon. He hadn't seen the horizon for 12 years. Basic things that we all take for granted that Julian is now adjusting to, having been kept in a confined space since 2012. And so I think this is going to take time. We had a nurse with us on the flight because we were concerned about his health to monitor him the entire way back. He will be receiving medical care now that he's returned to Australia. And I really urge people to allow him and his family privacy. This has been a huge ordeal, and it's time to allow them time to be together, to rebuild their lives, and to allow him to recover from what has been a 14-year-long political persecution.
Jen Robinson, after the last few days, thank you very much indeed for coming in to talk to us.
You're very welcome.